In August 1914, as the greatest armies the world had ever seen, mobilized in their millions, Germany, France, Russia, each fielding masses of conscripts numbering in the hundreds of thousands, Britain sent to the continent a force of barely 100,000 men, a tiny army by the standards of the age. But it was, man for man, perhaps the finest infantry in the world. Long-service professional soldiers, superbly trained, who could pour out rifle fire so fast and so accurate that the enemy would swear they were facing machine guns. This was the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and within a few weeks of landing in France, it would fight a desperate delaying action that helped save the Allied cause and then be all but destroyed doing it. The German Kaiser is said to have sneered at this contemptible little army. The men who survived took that insult and wore it like a medal, calling themselves ever after the old Contemptibles. This is the story of that army, how Britain built it, why it was so deadly, how it bled to death in the mud of 1914, and how, out of its ashes, rose the largest army Britain would ever field. To understand the BEF, you have to understand how differently Britain made war. The great continental powers built their security on the army. Germany, France, Russia, each conscripted its young men by the million, training them for a few years and then holding them in reserve so that on the day of mobilization they could summon vast citizen armies out of the population almost overnight. Britain did none of this. Britain was an island and an empire, and its shield was not an army, but a navy, the Royal Navy, the largest and most powerful fleet on earth, which guarded the home islands and the trade routes that kept the empire alive. There was no conscription in Britain. The army was small, and every man in it was a volunteer, a long-service professional who signed on for years, not months. Its job, traditionally, was to police the empire, to fight small colonial wars in far-off places, not to stand in the line of battle against a European great power. So when Britain did need to send troops to the continent, it could not summon millions. It could send only a small, hard core of professionals. That force had a name, the British Expeditionary Force. And that force did not come together by accident. After the hard lessons of the Boer War, where Britain's army had struggled badly against a handful of farmers, a reforming Secretary of State for War named Richard Haldane set out to modernize it. Between 1906 and 1912, the Haldane reforms rebuilt the British Army for a new kind of war, a war on the continent of Europe. Haldane created for the first time a proper expeditionary force, a ready-made striking force that could be mobilized and shipped across the Channel at short notice. On paper, it was 6 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, around 100,000 fighting men, organized into army corps, complete with their own artillery, supply, and staff. Behind them, at home, Haldane created the Territorial Force, part-time volunteer soldiers who would defend Britain and provide a pool of reserves. It was a deliberate professional instrument, designed for exactly the scenario that came to pass in 1914. When the call came, the BEF was ready, and it sailed for France under its commander, Field Marshal Sir John French. What made these men so formidable was not their numbers, it was their skill, and above all, their shooting. The British regular soldier of 1914 was a master of the rifle in a way no conscript army could match. His weapon was the Lee Enfield, the short, Magazine Lee Enfield, or SMLE, a bolt-action rifle with a smooth, fast action and a 10-round magazine, more than most rifles of the day. and the British soldier was trained to use it with a speed that seems almost unbelievable. The standard he was drilled to reach was called the Mad Minute. 15 aimed shots hitting a target the size of a dinner plate at 300 yards in 60 seconds. The very best could manage 30 rounds a minute or more. When the Germans first came up against this wall of rifle fire at close range, they could not believe it came from ordinary infantry. They were convinced that every British battalion must be equipped with dozens of machine guns, when in truth, each one had only 2. That was the deadly secret of the little army. Not machines, but men, and the years of training behind every trigger pull. There is a famous story about how these soldiers got their name. As the BEF marched to meet the German advance, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, is said to have issued a furious order to his generals to exterminate the treacherous English and walk over General French's contemptible little army. Whether he ever really said it, no one has been able to prove. No copy of such an order has ever been found, and it may well have been British propaganda. But it did not matter. The phrase caught fire. The men of the 1914 army seized on it with grim, delighted pride. If the most powerful monarch in Europe thought them a contemptible little army, then that is exactly what they would call themselves. And so the survivors of that first terrible autumn, the dwindling few who had crossed to France in August and lived, became known forever after by one of the proudest nicknames any soldiers ever bore, the Old Contemptibles. The BEF began crossing the Channel in the middle of August 1914, landing in France and marching northeast into Belgium to take its place on the left of the huge French army. And there, on the 23rd of August, at a mining town called Mons, it met the German advance head-on. The BEF took up a position along a canal and waited. The Germans came on in their thousands, advancing in dense masses across open ground, and the British regulars opened fire. That fabled rifle discipline now did its terrible work. Rank after rank of German infantry was cut down by rifle fire so rapid and so accurate that once again the attackers believed they faced a line of machine guns. For a day, a single thin line of British professionals held up an entire German army and inflicted heavy losses. But the BEF was hopelessly outnumbered, and the French army beside it was falling back. To avoid being surrounded and destroyed, the little army had no choice but to abandon its hard-won line at Mons and begin one of the most grueling retreats in its history. What followed was 13 days that tested the BEF to its limits. Falling back before the advancing Germans, the little army retreated some 400 kilometers, marching in the summer heat, day after day, exhausted, footsore, and constantly fighting rearguard actions to keep the enemy off its back. At Le Cateau, part of the BEF turned and fought a sharp, bloody delaying battle to buy time, then slipped away again. It was a retreat, but it was not a rout. The discipline of the professionals held. Bone-tired men marched in their sleep and still formed firing lines when the Germans pressed too close. The BEF fell back past the River Marne, drawing ever nearer to Paris, until at last the exhausted Allied line could retreat no further. And there, at the very gates of the French capital, the tide of the whole war was about to turn. In early September 1914, the French and British armies stopped running and struck back. At the First Battle of the Marne, the Allies counterattacked into a gap that had opened in the German advance and drove the Germans back from the outskirts of Paris. It was one of the decisive moments of the 20th century. It denied Germany the swift victory its entire war plan had depended on. and doomed both sides to a long war instead. But the fighting was not over. As the two exhausted sides raced north to outflank each other, they collided again in Belgium, around the old town of Ypres. Through October and November, at the First Battle of Ypres, the last of the old regular BEF stood and held the line against furious German assaults, and in doing so was largely wiped out. By the time the fighting died down as winter set in, something new and terrible had appeared. Both armies dug into the earth, and a continuous line of trenches now stretched from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss frontier, 400 miles of deadlock. The war of movement was over. The war of the trenches had begun. And the old professional army had, in effect, died to make it possible. By the end of 1914, the original BEF, those superbly trained regulars who had sailed in August, had suffered such catastrophic losses at Mons, Le Cateau, the Marne and Ypres that it had lost most of its fighting strength. The old Contemptibles were a spent force. But Britain now understood that this would be a war of nations, demanding not thousands, but millions of men. Even as the regulars fought and died, a new army was being raised behind them. The War Minister, Lord Kitchener, called for volunteers, and they came forward in their hundreds of thousands, whole streets and factories and football teams enlisting together in what became known as the PALS battalions. When even that was not enough, Britain did the once unthinkable and introduced conscription in 1916. The tiny professional force of 100,000 swelled over 4 years into a citizen army of millions, growing from 2 small corps in 1914 into 5 great armies by war's end. So the British Expeditionary Force that ended the war was almost nothing like the one that began it. The small, elite, professional army of August 1914, the old Contemptibles, was gone by Christmas, buried in the fields of Belgium and France. In its place stood the largest army Britain has ever put into the field. Over 5 million men would pass through its ranks, an army of volunteers and conscripts, of clerks and miners and shopkeepers turned soldiers. And that citizen army, forged in the disasters of the early war, would in the end learn its brutal trade, until, in the final months of 1918, it stood as one of the most formidable fighting forces on earth, and spearheaded the offensives that finally broke the German army and won the war. But it was the old professionals who had bought the time for all of it, a few tens of thousands of long-service riflemen who stood in the path of an empire in the terrible autumn of 1914 and held the old Contemptibles, a small army that died to save an alliance and lit the fuse of the greatest one Britain ever raised.